Hi, I'm Joan from Joni Rose Sewing. Today we're going to be sewing this blue Hawaii beginner sewing pattern. I'm also doing a giveaway for one of these finished designs, and you can enter by liking, subscribing, and commenting down below. You can get additional entries by going to my other social medias, which are also linked below. Now, this pattern mostly consists of sewing straight and attaching hook and loop tape, which we will also be going over. So if that sounds good to you, you can hop on over to my website, jonirosesewing.com, which is also linked below, and get the pattern for free. Okay, without further ado, let's start sewing. The first thing we want to do is print out our pattern at 100% scale. Check that your pattern right here, this is where you can check to make sure that it's scaled correctly. Gonna measure 1 inch or measure 1 centimeter. And when it looks good, you can start cutting. Now these are all of our pattern pieces cut out. Make sure when you cut the front and side pieces, you take special care to include these notches. Next, cut your Velcro out. The 1 inch length will be used for the back of the bodice, and the 3/4 of an inch length will be used for the skirt. Optionally, we have lace to cut. This is about a 1/2 inch width of lace, and you can either cut it now or you can wait until further just to measure it on your piece while you're sewing. If you want to cut it now, for the bodice, you're going to cut 12 inches of lace, and for the skirt, you want to cut 13¼ inch of lace. Here I am cutting out the pattern pieces, including the triangle notches. If you'd like an alternative to the triangle notches, you can also snip into the seam allowance where the notches are. Okay, now that we're here, we're going to mark on our right side of the fabric. First, the lace lines, if you are doing lace. This should be a little bit more in than 1/4 inch because we don't want to end up sewing our lace over our seam allowance. If you have difficulty marking where the lace should go, you can snip the paper pattern piece where the lace should be and then fold the paper up so that way you'll be able to mark it more accurately along the line. Because when you flip the pattern piece over, it can be difficult to see that line. To mark where the angled hook and loop tape should go, I cut this area out and then I outline the now cut out area in chalk. Now that we have all of our pieces, we can get started sewing. So actually, before we get started sewing, we're going to make our straps. And now our straps need some prep work. First, what we're going to do is take one side and fold it 1/4 of an inch in. Then we are going to press that down. And then we're going to take both sides. We're going to fold them into the center here. And then after they're folded into the center, we're going to press those down, and then we're going to fold over and do a final press. And then just to make sure that it stays that way, I like to just clip it. Okay, now that we have both of our straps, we are finally ready to get sewing. Now here we are at the sewing machine. We're going to sew these straps closed. I like to use this edging foot right here just so I can get right along the edge of the snaps. We're going to be sewing this open spot closed. We are going to start and end with a back stitch. Now you should have your 2 straps closed and completed. Now we're going to sew our bodice pieces together. So taking right sides together, we want to match up the notches, which on these pieces, we made the visible triangles, and on these pieces, we're gonna have to look closer for our cut notches. And so we are going to match those notches right up, and then you can either pin or clip together. And now we are going to sew with a 1/4 seam allowance on each of these edges. So now that your separate bodice pieces are sewn together, you are going to open them up. And then you want to press these seams open. And you can either do that with an iron or a finger press also works. Optionally, if you're using lace, now's the time to measure it out if you haven't cut it. Now it should be about 12 inches long, but you can check your piece and just go along here, go to where your markings are. And now that should be, yep, 12 inches. And now what you're gonna wanna do is clip or pin this lace here, and then we're going to baste it on. So now we wanna clip our straps on because we're gonna baste those as well. And where you wanna have your outside seam, if you wanna have it symmetrical, make sure that the outside seams are facing symmetrically, and you're going to be clipping them in the middle of where this straight line on the bodice is. Okay, so now time to baste. I'm gonna be using an edging foot so I can just get right along the sides, and then I'm going to be setting my wheel here, my stitch length, to 4. And for this, there's no need to backstitch. Now that we've basted our piece together, our next step is to end up sewing our bodice pieces together like this, right sides together. Now some steps I take ahead of time are sometimes the straps get in the way, so I just like to fold them up and then put them in either a clip or something like a paper clip, or tie them together somehow, so that way they don't really get in the way while we're sewing. Or if they do, it's just easy to move them and they're pretty noticeable. Okay, and now right sides together, we will clip them. A pinning tip is to make sure that all of these open seams match up. Okay, now that our piece is pinned or clipped together, we are going to sew along here, up here, all the way around, and we're going to be leaving one side open. If you have trouble sewing V's, you can use your sewing piece to draw yourself a little guide with chalk beforehand. And you want to do this on the side, of course, that you will be sewing. Okay, so now we will be sewing this piece with a 2.5 stitch length and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For the short end we leave open, we want our stitches to start 1/4 inch away from the edge because we fold that edge over later. When we get to this V here, you can see the markings there. Now sometimes it's a little bit difficult to turn it around, and if you're having trouble with the V's, I recommend that you turn your stitch length down. So right now it's 2.5, but something like 2 or even 1.5 can help you have a little bit more control over it. Our next step is to clip our seam allowance and clip those curves, making sure not to cut into our sewn seam. Where the V is, you want to cut another little V or a triangle where the seam allowance is. This will help make it a lot easier to flip the garment inside out. Before we flip it inside out, we want to prep for our next step, which will be when we sew this side closed. So what we want to do is fold this down 1/4 of an inch and then press. Now we're going to be turning this piece inside out. So now that we have our top, we are going to turn in that open edge 1/4 of an inch, and when we have it laying flat like that, We can either just sew across it, or we can slip stitch it closed for a cleaner, invisible finish. Now we will be attaching Velcro to this side, so it will be having a seam anyway, but it's up to you. So slip stitching is hand stitching it, and I have my needle here with some matching color thread, and I am going to start off by tying a double knot at the end of here. Then I'm going to be taking this piece and starting, we don't want to ever hit the outside of this piece because the goal is for it to be invisible. And I'm going to be putting it in this under layer here, so that way the knot is hidden on the inside. Then I'm going to be ladder stitching it on each of these sides. So basically what I'm going to be doing is taking this, just this 1/4 hidden layer on the inside, going in it, out it, pulling through, and then doing that with the other side where it goes in the layer, out of the layer, and pulls through. And then you're just going to keep repeating that all the way down. Okay, and then once it's all closed, we're going to be tying a knot. And how I like to tie my knots are, I like to go back where this previous stitch was, go a little bit into the fabric as well, pull it through, then put my needle back in this loop and pull it tight. Now after doing that twice, you can just cut the edge. Now we'll be deciding where we are attaching our Velcro. So we want one side to be 1/8 of an inch from the edge. The other side is gonna be here. I have literally done them both on the same side before and had to seam rip them out. So make sure they're both on the right side. One should be on one side of the fabric and one should be on the other side of the fabric, and about 1/8 away. And now we are going to sew those, and then we will be done with our bodice. Okay, now we will be sewing the hook and loop tape on. I like to change my stitch length to 2 because it gives me a little bit more control over such a small amount. This is our 1-inch hook and loop tape, not our 3/4 of an inch tape. So make sure that you're using the right tape. You want to start and end with a back stitch. I am using my edging foot. Now that our bodice is completed, we are going to be moving on to the tie. We are going to take our tie and we are going to put the right sides together, and we are either going to clip or pin all the way around here, and we are going to leave this side as an opening gap. And this is what it'll look like pinned. We're going to be sewing all the way around here, keeping this in between these 2 purple clips. We're going to be keeping that spot open. So with a 2.5 stitch length, we are going to be sewing around here, leaving this open, and we're going to start and end with a back stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that we have our tie, we are going to clip these edges so we can turn it inside out. And then we are going to iron this side 1/4 inch in, so that way when we turn it inside out, we can sew it closed. Now we can also slip stitch here, but because it's the tie, it will mostly be hidden. I'm fine with just using a normal stitch, but it's up to you. We are going to start and end with a back stitch. Use a 2.5-inch stitch length and just sew right along here. Now that we are done with our bodice, I'm going to show you how to attach it. Put the bodice piece on. And then in the front here, we're going to take the tie and we're going to slide it right where this V is. We're going to slide it under the top, pull it through, take the pieces together and tie a single knot. Take the side part of the tie, pull out to the right and left, and there you go. Now we are moving on to the skirt. And now if you are using lace, is a good time to measure it out. It should be about 13.25 inches, but you can also just measure where your markings are and cut it right there. Yep, about 13.25. Now what we're going to do is pin this on and then baste it to the skirt. So we are going to be basting this lace with this edging foot at a 4 stitch length, and no need to backstitch. So now that we are done basting, we are going to be taking each right side and putting them together, and then we are going to be sewing all along these edges here. Now we're going to be sewing about 1 inch in and 1 inch in, leaving this open for us to turn inside out. And now we are ready to sew at 1/4 inch seam allowance all along here. We are starting and ending with a back stitch, 1/4 inch seam allowance at a 2.5 stitch length. Okay, and so once we've sewn all those, we're going to clip our corners here, and then we are going to iron this open 1/4 of an inch, so that way we can sew along here. Ironing that side, we can turn it inside out. I like to do this shimmy back and forth, and that really helps. So now, see, it's already closed up for us. You can either slip stitch it closed, or because we are going to be top stitching this anyway, I like to just top stitch it. Now before we get to top stitching and press this all down nice and flat, I like that because it helps make sewing it a little bit easier. Try to keep it, when you're ironing, keep it closed so that way you don't see the other side from either side. Okay, and we are ready to do our top stitching. Okay, and I have switched to my edging foot. Now that we have our skirt piece almost finished, we just have to attach our Velcro. Now, I have the markings from prior for where the hook and loop tape should go. Right before, I suggest trying it on one of the dolls just to make sure that everything's all matched up. So the tape would go right here. And so what we can do is, it looks good to me, but just in case, you can also pin. Try it on. And that's the little sneak peek of how it'll look. So now that it's looking good, I'm going to take these to the sewing machine and attach the pieces. Okay, so now it's time to sew this piece on. We're going to start and end with a back stitch. I'm going to change my stitch length to 2 instead of 2.5 because it gives me a little bit more control over these corners. And lastly, I'm using an edging foot. Now I'm sewing the diagonal piece. And now at this stage, you can call it done and say you have the completed skirt. There it is. Now the last thing we can do is add a button or some sort of decor to this side here. But look at that, it's already basically done. What I'm gonna do is just add on a button here, and you can add on a button or any other sort of decor on either or both sides. I'm just gonna be showing you how it looks on one side, and I'm gonna be adding this button right here. So for attaching this button, there's a couple things you could do. One, you could just machine sew it. Now the Velcro is on the back here, so going through that, it will still work, but it's not gonna be the cleanest finish. Same with if you hand sew, it is easier just to go straight through both sides of the fabric, and it will still work. It won't be the cleanest finish, but it definitely will be fine and be hidden in the hook and loop tape. So those are both decent options to do. The last option that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hand sew it by only going through this first layer here of fabric. So I'm not gonna push it all the way through. I'm just gonna go through this layer of fabric here. And now what I have here is I have my knot tied at the end, and I'm going to start by putting it through fabric here, back up. And we are going to end by making a knot. I like to put my needle under the button thread and then pull it through the circle of thread as you see there, and then pull it tight. Now that we have completed the last optional step, the outfit is completed. And there we have it. And ta-da! You're done. If you like this pattern, subscribe and follow me on other social medias because I'm definitely going to be releasing more. And if you're interested in the giveaway, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It ends June 31st, 2024. And you can check out my other social medias for additional entries. Well, thanks so much for sewing with me.